Welcome to Stories from the Center of the Universe, the podcast about the human experience.
John Hollis, welcome back to the Center of the Universe, man.
Hey, it's great to be here, Paul. Thanks again for having me. I've been looking forward to it all week.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I've been looking forward to getting back together with you to talk about Sergeant Rodney Davis. You wrote an op-ed that I think was printed on Memorial Day, right?
Correct. That's correct. The Richmond Times-Dispatch.
Yeah, and I wasn't, and I should have been a lot more thoughtful about this. I should have had you on before Memorial Day, and I release all my episodes on Mondays, so it would have been a natural fit. I just, you get busy running around and you don't connect all the dots all the time, but his story is incredible any day of the year, and so I'm happy to be talking to you about it. And you are obviously very well versed in the story. You wrote a book about him as a man, I think, right? I haven't read the book.
Correct.
Maybe I should have read the book before we talked about this. But you did send me a nice write-up and the op-ed piece you did.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let's just get into it. Who was Rodney Davis before he joined the Marine Corps?
Sure. Rodney Davis was the second oldest of five kids born and raised in Macon, Georgia, in the heart of the Jim Crow South. Like a lot of African Americans at that time, there were not a whole lot of opportunities in places like Macon, Georgia, for young black men, and so he chose to go to the Marine Corps. He had always wanted to go out and see the world. The idea of wearing those dress blues, all that stuff appealed to him from a young age. So rather than follow his older brother to college, he surprised his mom and dad. Said, "Hey, came in dinner one night and said, 'Hey, I went down to the recruiting station and signed up and joined the Marine Corps.'" And that was in April or May of 1961. He joined the Marine Corps, and he excelled. Went to Parris Island. The first time he lived on his own. Went to Parris Island and did the boot camp there. Ended up getting a prestigious gig as a U.S. security part of the Marine security detail at the U.S. Embassy in London, which is a very cush gig. I mean, that's if you're a Marine, that's like one of the highest honors you can get. Because our most pristine embassy, our chief ally in London, and he was there for 3 years. That's where he met his wife, and they had two baby girls. But the Vietnam War was taken off, and his tour of duty in London ended in May of 1967. And like most Marines, when there's fighting going on, there's bullets flying, they run to it. And so Rodney volunteered for duty in Vietnam. He'd been in country 3 weeks when he was killed September 6, 1967, as part of Operation Swift. It was one of the bloodiest days of the war for the entire 1st Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment.
Well, in your articles, the numbers they were outnumbered. The ratio was 12-1, 2,500 versus 200. They
basically, his company of 200 Marines, a Bravo company, basically walked into a trap, L-shaped trap, set by the NVA. It was estimated force to be of 2,500 men. It was hand-to-hand combat. The only reason any of them survived at all, because the NVA were coming across a huge rice paddy, they were able to bring artillery and air power to bear basically on top of their own positions to keep them alive.
Yeah, the number from his platoon started with 48, and only 11 remained on the battlefield as the battle was ending because everybody else was either wounded, had to be medevaced, or they were killed. And even out of the remaining 11, your article said 8 were wounded to the point that they received Purple Hearts.
That's correct. But they were, so it was basically 100% casualties. That's how egregious the casualties were. It was just a bloodbath. It was one of the worst battles of the entire Vietnam War.
Yeah. So let's back up on Rodney. So a story of a black guy who's graduating high school in Macon, Georgia. I thought you were going to tell me his older sibling just went to work or maybe also joined the military because that was the only option. College, I was going to guess, was not really an option. But the fact that he comes from a family that sent the firstborn to college and then he still chose the Marine Corps meant he really wanted to serve.
He really did. His father had served in the Navy in World War II, and like his father, he wanted to test himself. And he also wanted to get out and see the world and get out from the confines of Macon, small Macon, Georgia. And Rodney also worried about his older brother was a year older and was in college, and he worried whether his family could afford sending both of them to college simultaneously. So I'm sure that was the finances was certainly part of his reasoning as well. But the biggest thing is he just wanted to get out and see the world, and as a kid, had always dreamed of seeing himself in those Marine dress blue uniforms, and He loved his country. No matter his faults, Rodney Davis loved his country. That never changed.
Loved his country, despite Jim Crow laws being like inhumane laws, right?
Yep.
By the way, were you born the same year he died?
I was born in December of '66.
So a few months.
I was alive when he died. Yes.
Yeah. And obviously you didn't meet him, or you never met him because he died when you were an infant. But and you were telling me before we started recording, like, well, let's go through when the battle began, what you know about his actions once that started.
Sure. Basically, they were the NVA back then very rarely stopped and squared off against the Americans because the U.S. had such huge advance in technological and air superiority. So basically, it was like hit and runs, guerrilla warfare mostly. And so they had a big battle 2 days earlier, September 4th, and the Marines went out not expecting. Basically, they thought it was just cleanup operations. They thought the NVA retreated across the border back into Cambodia, did not expect a major blow up that day. But the NVA this time were sitting there lying in wait. And they went to a village, went to this one village called Chow Lam. There was an NVA flag still flying on the flagpole in the middle of the village. There was food still warm in the village. So the NVA had just left. And so I remember I spoke to the platoon commander. Well, clearly they were obviously somewhere close by if the food is still warm, and they're clearly obviously watching you. Why did you continue going forward? We were under orders to find the enemy and to make contact. So they marched out to that rice paddy, and they walked right into the buzzsaw that the NVA had waiting for them.
Yeah, and that's how the U.S. Army and the Marine Corps, that's how they spent several years in Vietnam. The Army guys call it movement to contact, but it's like, hey, we're out here in the jungle and we're gonna mix it up, and whatever we run up against, we're gonna run up against, and it is what it is. It seems kind of crazy to think about that in 2024.
It is, but the U.S. is basically overconfidence in technological superiority, overconfidence in artillery, overconfidence in air power, and they thought no matter once we make them engage, we can apply all those things and we'll wipe out the enemy. But the problem is the enemy doesn't always play by your rules, and they found that out in the hard way in Vietnam.
Yeah, and the ratio, who cares what the technology advantage is? It's really hard to deal with that kind of ratio. And they had the element of surprise, and
right.
And the U.S.
almost surprised on their home territory, and there was a reason why they were coming in mass like that, because they knew that the closer they got, they could negate the American artillery strikes. So they knew they had to get on them right away.
Right. No, that all makes sense. Is the platoon commander going on your trip in August?
He passed away. All the 5 men who were in that trench with Sergeant Davis have since passed away. I think the last one passed away, but 2 years ago. And so I was very blessed and very smart to have interviewed them all before we lost them. But they were all fantastic. As you can imagine, it was some of the hardest interviews I've ever done in my life. I always tell my friends, I've been a journalist my entire life. I've interviewed thousands and thousands of professional athletes, college athletes, celebrities, the whole nine. Nothing was as hard as interviewing those men about that battle, because you have to realize this is the most horrific day of these gentlemen's life. And so but if you're writing a book about it, you got to ask very detailed questions, poignant questions, but yet still being sensitive to the fact that this was the most horrific day of these guys' lives. And by asking these questions, you're rehashing those ghosts that they buried away for so long. I will always be forever indebted to those Marines for taking me into their own ranks and trusting me with their story and giving me all those horrible details. So many times I sat with them, I cried with them. If you heard the story and how horrific it was and some of the details, if you didn't cry, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, those Marines had probably refused to tell stories to their spouses or their kids after they came home. And the fact that I'm guessing you're a nuanced guy. You're very good at what you do. You're good at establishing relationships, which was a big part of it. But it sounds like a big part of why they were willing to be so open with you is because of their respect for Sergeant Davis in general and what he did that day.
It is. Almost every last one of them said, we owe, especially the 5 men who survived, we owe Rodney Davis that much. He saved our lives. We owe him that much to be able to tell this story. And his story is their story. I tell them all that. Rodney Davis was a hero, but they're all heroes. Every last one of them. We're talking about 200 men against a charging NVA army of 2,500 men. I'm not so sure what I would do in that situation, but those guys cowboyed up, and they They didn't run away. That was a very strategically important valley in the Quezon Valley. It's very important to both the Vietnamese and the Americans because it's a large supply of rice in the valley, but more importantly, the source of conscripts that the North Vietnamese desperately needed. Keeping control of that strategically important valley was critical that summer.
All right, let's go through the details of what happened that day from your best understanding of Rodney Davis's perspective that day, what he would have experienced.
Sure. He was a right guy in the platoon, which basically mean he was the third highest ranking guy in the platoon. As a right guide, he was in charge of getting whatever the other Marines needed, whether it be socks, cigarettes, ammunition, whatever. And he was basically always in constant contact with the platoon sergeant and the platoon commander. It was a thankless job because there's like always a million things he needed to be doing. But Rodney seemed like he'd only been in country 3 weeks, but he had already established his bona fides with the way he carried himself and the professionalism which he handled himself as a Marine. As it turns out, though, when they walked out that rice paddy, all hell broke loose. All kinds of small arms, machine gun fire broke loose, and the MVA were trying to flank them. And Rodney took over. The platoon commander was in a trench about 50 yards back because when all the bullets started flying, everybody just ducked for cover wherever he could. First of all, it just happened to be the platoon commander was about 50 yards back, and so Rodney took over that void, redirected their men to better strategic positions to make sure the MVA didn't flank them, and walked up and down the line, reassuring their men that they're going to be okay. Then when another wave came in, they started getting, as they were shooting, of course, as some of them were shooting, some of the other MVA were crawling, get closer and closer. And then it became like something kind of a surreal, throwing grenades. The Marines would jump out of the trench, grenades would go off, and they'd jump back in the trench, the more gunfire came. And it was like, went like that for a few minutes. So finally, they threw 2 grenades at once. One went high, made the Marines duck their head. The other one hit one of the other Marines in the leg and fell into the trench, which Rodney Davis was sharing with 5 Marines. Given the cacophony of noise, the machine gun fire, all the explosions, the other Marines are firing in that trench did not see or hear that grenade at their feet. They all would have died immediately if he had not acted without thought. But Rodney jumped on that grenade. And he's not just jumping on it. He used both hands to pull it underneath himself. So he knew exactly what he was doing. But the thing is, Rodney had always grown up thinking that once he became a Marine, that nothing could ever get to him, that he was indestructible because he was a Marine. He always loved the U.S. Marine Corps. And in a lot of ways he is, because in death of this story, he's much bigger in death than he maybe been ever in life. His story, his name goes far beyond his hometown of Macon, Georgia. Now you've got pictures of him in the White House and the Pentagon, his name being treated with reverence in some of the highest powers of halls of power in the United States because of that one moment.
They named a ship after him.
They named a combat ship after him. His name, the USS Rodney Davis, was a Perry-class frigate, was the U.S. Navy's first warship named after an African-American Medal of Honor recipient. There have been 3 others before that, 3 other ships named after African-American Medal of Honor recipients, but they were not warships. They're like naval ships, stuff like that. His was the first warship named after African-American Medal. Right. Yeah. His was the first one. And so, for me, it's like the Pentagon was so helpful to me. I mean, I cannot say enough great things about the Pentagon, particularly the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Navy. They've been fantastic. When I was in the writing of this book, I knew I needed records. I needed his military records. And I had a lot of friends in Washington, the military community helped me. And I ended up doing a PowerPoint presentation in front of the Pentagon, in front of 3 generals and 2 colonels. And one of the generals was a 3-star, a lieutenant general. And they knew Rodney Davis's name. But when I told them the whole black and white aspect of it, of course, when the Marines issue release, it said he saved 5 Marines. Did not say black Marines or white Marines because Marines don't care. Marine green is the only color they care about, and that was it. But when they found out, when I told those generals that all 5 of those men were white, it was in 1967, when more than 100 American cities had race riots that summer, where Jim Crow was still the law of the land in Macon, Georgia. Rodney Davis could have gone home with those same Marines that he fought and died for, wouldn't have been allowed to eat in the same restaurants with them. But he loved his country and he loved his fellow Marines that much. So when I told these generals all these story, Paul, I could see the gears grinding in their mind because they could see the PR on this one. So I was there for like 45 minutes at the Pentagon, gave this PowerPoint presentation, had not even gotten back to my car yet after finishing when there was an email from the 3-star general to the Pentagon chief archivist, chief historian, that John Hollis was to have everything the Pentagon had on Sergeant Rodney Davis. They gave me everything with his name on it. From his initial documents we signed up to all the way to every piece of paper in the entire Medal of Honor investigation, starting from the people who were in that trench with him, the witnesses, all the way to the entire chain of command to William Westmoreland himself.
Wow.
Yep. I even had the president signing off on him getting the Medal of Honor. They gave me all that paperwork, all of it.
What year was this when you talked to them?
I think it was 2016, 17.
So his story had been told fairly well. I'm guessing.
Not really, actually. Not really. It was just a story that he jumped on a grenade and saved 5 Marines. That was it.
So it was sort of an internal story that the Marine Corps knew well, and whoever got involved in the Medal of Honor process, they knew well. But from a journalistic perspective, not
well. The
really.
Marines knew it. I mean, I guess the guys with him knew they were all white, but for them, they were not journalists. They didn't. Quite honestly, I talked to all these guys. I asked them that question. What wasn't amazing to you guys that you're all white and he's black? But they never look at it that way. They look at Rodney as just a Marine, just like them. But for those on the outside, that's a hell of a story. And, I remember when I first found out that he jumped on a grenade, I remember talking to his late mother before she passed away, and it was an incredible story. Well, then I found out about the black and white aspect of it. That changes everything. That's a whole different dynamic then. 1967 Jim Crow South. That's a whole different dynamic. And I always tell people, when I put in my book, to tell people just how divisive the issue of race was back then. Not only with the more than 100 cities had race riots, we had 20 U.S. senators in early September 1967. 20 U.S. senators, 1/5 of the U.S. Senate, refused to vote for Thurgood Marshall to become the first black Supreme Court justice. Think about that. Can you imagine a scenario where 1/5 of the U.S. Senate does not vote on a Supreme Court justice? And basically, that was LBJ calling in favors and telling those guys to be out of town or whatever, rather than vote and make your constituents mad. But that's how divisive the issue of race was. But ironically, 10,000 miles away, the closest thing to hell on earth there was at that time, these Marines had it right. It didn't matter what color you were. It didn't matter what your daddy did, where you were from. As long as you got my back, because we're all Americans, brothers in arms, and we bleed the same color red.
If you take a step back, John, do you find it incredible that nobody really picked up on his story the way that you did, to give it full breath the way you did?
Yes, I did. I've asked the people so many times. You think about like war heroes, like great stories. Everybody's heard of Audie Murphy, for example, right? Great story. And I certainly no disrespect to Audie Murphy. He's a great American. He's a great hero. But this story to me is even more amazing because of the black and white issue of it. Vietnam was the nation's first fully integrated war. So it's the first time we had black soldiers and white soldiers living together on a permanent basis. And they realized they're the same. You have the same hopes, the same dreams. You want the best for your kids and your families, and you want to get home alive. And you bleed the same color red. They found out they have more alike than they were in common.
Yeah, and when you live with somebody, you really get to know them, right? But to your point, he was only there 3 weeks, and he just met the members of his platoon weeks before he died, right?
Right. Most of them he had just met last 2 or 3 weeks earlier. The one guy who's to his immediate right, Randy Lee, passed away 2 years ago. Randy had been in the hospital with malaria and had never even met Sergeant Davis or even as much as even spoken to him. He had just gotten out of the hospital with malaria the day before. And just after the chaos of combat, ended up beside Rodney in that trench. And he owes his entire life because a poor black kid from Macon, Georgia, he had never met before, took one for him and everybody else.
Yeah, man, I bet as you were writing the book and you were doing all of these interviews and research, you desperately wanted to meet the man, right?
I wish I had. I've told the Davis family that so many times. I wish I had, because anybody had that kind of courage, I would love to shake his hand, because you always ask yourself, what would I do in that situation? And I'm not going to sit there and tell you that I would have done the same thing. And there's no right or wrong answer, especially the 1 and 2 year old daughter waiting for you at home and a wife. There's no right or wrong answer. And who was to say I wouldn't be mad that people who look like me were being treated like that? That basically 5 white guys that I didn't even know that I would do that. Everybody likes to believe the best of themselves. We like to believe that we'd be noble and do the right thing. And you don't know until you're in a situation. You don't know how you're going to behave or react. And there's no right or wrong answer. So for anybody to act, not only act decisively, but act without hesitation. Because if he had hesitated, that grenade would have gone off. They all would have died anyway. That's the part that's amazing. The fact he didn't hesitate and used both hands to stuff it under himself because he knew what he was doing.
I don't even want to begin to say 1 in whatever a giant number is. I mean, it's extremely rare what he did. even rarer for a father to do that. To your point. Yeah. I mean, I would love to think that I was magnanimous and wasn't affected by what was happening back in my, if I had to imagine being black in 1967, I'm pretty sure I'd have an attitude.
Yeah, you'd be bitter. You have good reason to be bitter, you know? Think of all the indignities you have to endure for the country that you love. It doesn't love you like you love it. And to me, the most amazing thing was like this whole race thing. But when I found out that all 5 of those guys were white, I didn't tell anybody, the family, until after it confirmed that all 5 of them were white. And I was absolutely incredulous because, like me, the Davis family for years and years had assumed that at least one or some of them men in that trench were black. And so when I confirmed that all 5 of them were white, and 2 of them had passed away before I even started writing the book, but I got pictures of them, and I had statements from them in the Medal of Honor investigation as well. But after confirming all 5 of them were white, I waited to a Davis family reunion, and I got up in front of the entire Davis family and told them, you could have heard a pin drop in that room. Because they knew what life was like for black people in Macon, Georgia at that time. And can you imagine? Literally their jaws were on the floor when I told them that.
Their brains were scrambled.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't imagine that, being in their shoes and hearing you say that.
And trust me, I quadruple checked it, got 100 times or something, because I want to make sure you don't get that one wrong.
Well, I'm glad you said that, actually, because a legitimate journalist desperately does not want to get that wrong, right?
No.
You're not trying to sensationalize. You're trying to be fact-based, and the wonderful part about being fact-based is the story is so powerful.
Exactly.
But when you play with the truth, and maybe let's just imagine the scenario: there was 1 black guy and 4 white guys that were saved that day. That
still would have been a good story.
It still would have been an amazing story. But maybe you say, maybe that black guy, we'll just say he's white in the story. No, I'm so glad that you have integrity in that way. And I wish more people were like you in that field, in your field. And actually, a lot of people that are so-called journalists, I don't know what to call them, but they're not journalists.
It was an incredible story. And like, I talked to all those Marines, and I went back to each one of them just to make sure, and I got pictures of all of them. They were all white, and I was just dumbfounded. I remember at the time, I was married at the time to Sergeant Davis's niece. I remember I told her, and she just couldn't get a word out. She was so incredulous by that fact. That changes everything in that story. Changes everything. Puts a lot more context on what he did, everything.
Oh, it makes it he's over. I mean, the bitter point that you were making, like, overcoming that bitterness is hard enough. But what he clearly had overcome it. I don't know if he was ever bitter. It sounds like maybe he wasn't just that way.
But the funny part is, after he joined the Marine Corps, he was in Camp Lejeune for a while, and his family, the Davis family, had kept all of his letters he wrote home when he was in the Marine Corps, which is a treasure trove of information for me, because I was able to get his voice in the story, just from his letters. And he talked about all the racist incidents he had at Camp Lejeune with other Marines. Come by spitting on his boot, freshly shined boots, calling the N-word, all that stuff, and then big fights break out, stuff like that. There were several fights. But the irony is, you go 10,000 miles away, you're surrounded by enemy everywhere. And I was telling my ex-wife, I was like, that's the thing. You got to take some people 10,000 miles away and shoot at them, apparently. Get some sense.
Yeah, I mean, look, we live in sort of this dream world here in the States, and people that haven't experienced anything outside of their county or their state, you're like, I'm gonna bark at the moon and be mad about everything. I'm like, you don't understand. We have it so much better in this country, and I'm not saying we're number one and we should all be super patriotic. I'm not saying that. I am saying that we have freedoms that people like Sergeant Davis and those Marines did not take for granted, and were willing to do really tough stuff to arguably defend our freedoms. I don't want to get into a should we have been in Vietnam conversation, even though I do have.
But I always tell people all the time, like, whatever your politics are, it doesn't really matter, because those soldiers, Army soldiers, the Marines, whoever, they don't make the orders. They go with their order to go. They don't make policy. These are 18 and 19. They were kids, 18, 19, 20 years old, asked to do a dirty job, and they answered the bell when America called. Simple as that.
Yeah, and kids have been doing that for generations in this country.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's an incredible story. Like I said, the Pentagon was fantastic. And all the paperwork, I got over 1,300 pages of documents from the Pentagon.
That's wild.
And of course I made copies of it and used it all. I gave it all to the Davis family.
Yeah, and I'm sure they cherish it.
Hey, I took out the autopsy reports though. That's about it. They didn't need to see that.
No, I'm glad they were doing autopsies back then. I didn't realize they autopsied all the KIAs.
Yep.
Yeah, you definitely. Yeah, that's no family needs to see that.
Yeah,
stuff.
Exactly.
All right, so you've had by like opening at least the country's eyes or the military and all that are associated with it. You've had kind of a 2014 and how many years did this take you from the time you realized?
I started research. It took a lot of years of research, but I wasn't doing it full time. Like I wrote a book on Lex Luger in between, like while I was researching this. So I kind of took
by the way, that I don't know what the term is, but you couldn't have two things that were more different.
Yeah, it was just weird, but so it took me about a total 8 years. I mean, you can imagine finding details of a battle that happened. This is before computer ages, right? So finding details of a battle that happened more than 50 years ago on the other side of the world took some doing. And luckily, I know a lot of people in D.C. It helped. Former Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage was a proud Navy veteran of three tours in Vietnam. He was a huge help. He opened the doors so much. He's the one who arranged me to get, meet with Pentagon folks. And Secretary Armitage also put me in touch with Colin Powell. In November 2019, I had breakfast with Colin Powell and Richard Armitage at Secretary Powell's house. He invited me to his home for breakfast. And we talked about the story of Sergeant Davis for over an hour.
You were talking to him when a lot of the world had spent, 10 plus years understanding his leadership principles, because they were so simple and common sense oriented, but they were brilliant.
They were. It was America's loss. We when we lost him, it was a big loss for America. He's a great man. Remember, I was so nervous walking through his door, Secretary Armitage. I'll just don't triple your feet as you walk in the door, whatever you do. That's one of the most nervous I've ever been in my life.
I bet. How did you connect to Armitage? I've
got a good friend of mine, Randy Shriver, is former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Sino-Pacific Affairs. He had introduced me. He's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. He had introduced me to Secretary Armitage maybe 22 years ago, something like that. And so Secretary Armitage has been like one of my favorite people in the world. I actually had lunch with him today, actually.
Really?
And, I did. Yep.
John, you are extremely well connected. What do you? I
don't know, but good BSer, I guess.
you think that's all it takes?
I don't know, maybe. I mean, I think people are just they know they can see I'm passionate about this story. I mean, Secretary Armitage and I hit it off right away because it was different when we first met. He was a huge basketball fan, huge sports fan. He was from Atlanta at the time. I was a sports writer at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. We knew a lot of some same people in Atlanta. So he and I hit it off great from the beginning. And when I told him about the story about Sergeant Davis, it really struck a chord for him. For a guy who served 3 tours in Vietnam and saw a lot of combat himself. And so he really went out of his way to help me because it's such a great story. You get a guy like him making a phone call and open a few doors for you. It's amazing how that helps.
No, I mean, he was huge. He was the highest parts of this country's power base, right, for years.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you had lunch with him today?
I did.
Who did I have lunch with? I have 2 dogs. My dogs and I had a salad today.
But again, I'm not trying to name drop, but he's Richard Armitage is one of the people I most admire and respect in this world. Don't say that.
How old is he now? Roughly?
I think he's 75 or so. Yeah. Plus, he has a basketball game he's organized since 1989, which I've been a regular in. Is a who's who of people playing basketball. So met a ton of people in that way, as well. So
is he still playing?
Up until 3 years ago, he was.
Good for him.
Yeah, he played football at the Naval Academy. He's loves sports, and so we talk sports all the time. We talk politics all the time, and he loved the story of Sergeant Davis. I mean, he was the biggest help to me. Like I said, he arranged for the Pentagon stuff to help me. He arranged for me to meet with Colin Powell. I remember when he called me. I was at work at George Mason University. He calls me on a Friday afternoon and says, "Yeah, me and Colin Powell, we're just talking about you and your book." Can you imagine getting a phone call like that? First of all,
it's like I think that's roughly the equivalent of somebody, Scottie Pippen calling me saying, yeah, Michael and I were just talking about you and this thing that you're doing.
It was on a Friday. I'll never forget. I kept telling him, I kept saying, I felt like I was getting punked. Like, where's the camera or something, right? And so I brought a book. Huh?
But you weren't being punked.
I was not, no. And so I saw Secretary Armitage the next day at our Saturday morning basketball game in Arlington. And I always got there early, to stretch out and give me like half hour, 45 minutes, sit and talk with him as we're stretching out. And I brought a book and I told him, here, I want you to give this to Secretary Powell. And he said, nope, you do it yourself. We're going to go to his house.
Okay.
And so about a week later, he calls me on a Friday, the next Friday, and says, you can't tell anybody just yet, but I think we're going to meet with Secretary Powell on Monday morning. He said, I'll call you on Sunday afternoon about 3 or 4 o'clock to confirm. So I had to go 48 hours knowing that I was most likely going to meet with Colin Powell on Monday morning without saying a word. I mean, Paul, it was the hardest thing in the world to keep my mouth shut. I wanted to scream from the highest mountaintop for 48 hours, but I couldn't do it. Plus, I would have been so disappointed if something had happened and fallen through. So Secretary Armitage calls me on a Sunday afternoon about 4 o'clock, says, we're good to go. Meet me tomorrow. We're going to go over to Secretary Powell's house. And so I called the Davis family afterwards. I told them, tomorrow morning, I'm meeting with Colin Powell tomorrow to talk about your brother. And Sergeant Davis' sister just started crying because, nothing obviously replaces the loss of your loved one. But to know that people like Colin Powell, that level, knew of him and wanted to know about his story made them feel good. And that made me feel good. Knowing you're doing something good and bringing some, peace and honor to a family, No,
it's amazing. I'm still having a tough time figuring out from 1967 or even 69 when his family accepted the Medal of Honor for him posthumously, how to 2014, how no one picked up on his story.
I don't know. I remember asking my ex-wife about that, and she was like, well, you're a journalist. You're used to asking questions. I don't know. To me, I would have found out. I remember telling her, like, if that were my brother, if my brother were killed in combat, obviously for like 6 months or a year, whatever, it's going to knock you to your knees, the sense of loss. I get that. But after a year or so, I would have wanted to know what happened. I would have wanted to talk to people who were there. But I think also part of it's, quite honestly, you're black in the Jim Crow South. I think that's part of it too. They were afraid to ask. And quite honestly, I know I'm a journalist at some of the highest levels. I know how to find information. I know how to people, if I can't get it, I know people who can get it for me.
Yeah. And as a black man, it hits you differently, the story, right?
It definitely did.
Yeah.
All the reasons you mentioned before. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're going to Vietnam, man, which I'm so happy for you. And I know through your research in the book and the story, it sounds like everybody has been great to you, but it continues with planning for the trip, right?
Yeah. The whole thing started, but Labor Day weekend, an officer who's a former military attaché, Marine Corps officer from former military attaché in Hanoi, and met him at a barbecue in DC. And he reached out to me about doing this trip. And I quite honestly, I was very fascinated by the idea, but I thought it was kind of pie in the sky stuff. Didn't really think it was really going to happen. And then it was maybe about a month, maybe 6 weeks later, I had a 2-hour dinner with General David Petraeus. And it was incredible in Arlington.
I mean, and you're not name dropping; it's just part of the story, right?
It was a huge part of the story. And Petraeus was great. General Petraeus is fantastic. We talked about his career, his book, everything else. He'd given a speech that night, and I was part of the people invited to have dinner with him afterwards, and his wife. And I told him, my friend, it was a friend of mine from Woodbury Forest, actually, who had arranged it. And he knew because I had written his story on Sergeant Davis. That's why he wanted me to introduce me to General Petraeus. So, of course, General Petraeus was very fascinated by the story. And when I told him about the possible trip to Vietnam, he told me the Army had done the same thing in 2019. They'd taken a whole bunch of paratroopers back to Hamburger Hill to commemorate the battle, 50th anniversary of that battle in 2019. And I thought that was great. He says, we got a guy who was a battalion commander who led them. And so I remember leaving General Petraeus at 9 o'clock on Tuesday night. You know that colonel, that battalion commander you're talking about, had him call me by 11 a.m. the next day. And he said, my name's Colonel Jeremy Bowling. I heard you met General Petraeus last night, and I was told to call you. Sir, yes, sir.
Well, there's probably a book talking to that guy and others that were part of that.
Colonel Bowling and Major Casey, the Marine Corps officer, they're both going with me. They've been a key part of the team, and I couldn't have done it without them because I didn't know, like, where do you even start for something like that? I mean, and the Department of Defense has been fantastic. I mean, they've been absolutely fantastic. We've been getting updates. They've sent me satellite photos of the area, the specific area where Sergeant Davis was killed, because I needed to know that. We're guys in their mid-70s, late 70s. I don't want them having to fight through the jungle in the bush or anything, at that age.
Yeah.
And so the area is completely accessible. It's like a farm area. There's no jungle at all. And so the Pentagon's been great. I cannot say great things about them.
How many folks are going?
We're going to have 14 people on our party.
I'm surprised it's not more than that.
Well, I wanted to keep the numbers small, much more manageable. And one of them, people going with us, is Sergeant Davis's daughter, his oldest daughter. She was just turned 2. Nikki Davis just turned 2 when her father was killed. And you can imagine it's going to be hard for her. And another gentleman going with us, he's the only active duty officer with us. His name is Major Steve Brackeen Tarunk. His grandfather was Sergeant Davis' platoon commander, standing right to Sergeant Davis' left. He had curled into a ball, thinking he saw the grenade the last second, thinking he was going to die. And the only reason he survived, he's like 3 feet away from Davis, so he would have died. Only reason he lives because Davis took that whole grenade. So his grandson is now entered the Marine Corps as a Marine Corps officer himself. I was there at his OCS graduation in 2014 when he got his gold bars. He went to the National Museum of the Marine Corps and did his ceremonial first salute to the picture of Rodney Davis.
Oh, man, that's so cool.
He is truly the embodiment of Sergeant Davis' gift of life, because his grandfather would have died that moment in the Quezon Valley in 1967 if it weren't for Rodney Davis. And he's alive now. Not only alive, but a Marine Corps officer.
How many people are alive because of Sergeant Davis's actions that day?
There are a lot. I mean, you figure their kids, for example, like the platoon commander, when he died, he had 6 kids and 15 grandkids at the time of his death. And they all did. I mean, they all had lots of kids. That's why I detail in my book, the last chapter, what each of those men did for the next 50 years. Jobs, kids, grandkids, all that stuff. All because of that, your life trajectory changes that one moment. I mean, it's heavy to think about. It's really heavy.
It's hard to wrap your head around it.
Your kids, your grandkids, none of them exist if it weren't for that one moment.
That's wild. He led to countless lives.
Yep. And it's like it's a rock skipping across the lake. It's a gift of life.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
And while we're there, we're going to be also meeting and dining with former North Vietnamese soldiers. The trip is a trip of healing and reconciliation for everybody.
Yeah, because from their perspective, they're going through a lot of the same challenges and struggles and emotions, and I know these guys that have seen hell on earth in the form of Operation Swift and maybe subsequent battles. They've been struggling their entire lives with it.
They have. And likewise, the Army had a great time with it in 2019. Colonel Bowling has been fantastic. He's talked to me about, because my first question was it awkward when those former paratroopers met up? I mean, that was such a bitter battle at Hamburger Hill. Was it awkward for them? And he said it was a little bit in the beginning, but they warmed up to each other. And by the end of the night, they were all drinking Jim Beam and pulling up each other's shirts, showing each other where they got hit. And they were hugging and laughing in friendship and camaraderie. There was one point they went, and that was hard going to the Hamburger Hill, because it was physically hard for those men to get to the top of that hill. And I think they took 20 men back in 2019, 20 former paratroopers. And most of those men, almost none of them had made it up to the top. Almost all, because that was an 11-day battle. Most of them had been hit and medevaced out, during the battle, never saw the top. So a lot of these men had to be physically helped up to the top. And they all brought like dog tags and mementos from their fallen friends and buried them at the top of that mountain.
Oh, wow.
Is that deep? I mean, that doesn't want to make you cry. Nothing will. But the peace it brought those men and the healing it brought them. There was a picture Colonel Bowling showed me of a Vietnamese woman. She had to be like 17, 18, 19 years old at the Battle of Hamburger Hill. She's holding an AK-47. It was hanging on the wall because they had a Vietnamese museum at the foot of the mountain, foot of that hill. And there were 2 troopers with her, arm in arm with her. And she's like 70 years old now, whatever. Arm in arm with her in front of that picture. I mean, it was incredible. It was absolutely incredible. And we're hoping for some of that same magic,
Yeah, I mean, I obviously hope you have an amazing trip. You learn everything you want to learn. You see everything you want to see, and everybody's safe and healthy throughout the whole thing. It's the 5 guys that were saved that day.
Mm-hmm.
To a man, I imagine they are all extremely grateful to Sergeant Davis?
Well, they've all passed away. The last one passed away 2 years ago of natural causes. But yes, they were all very grateful. I remember the one gentleman, Randy Leadham, the guy I said who'd been in the hospital with malaria. He told me he felt guilty even laying on a couch on a Saturday, Saturday, because like what am I doing? I owe this guy my life, and that's a heavy burden to live with, though. And he struggled. He struggled. They all did. They all struggled, and it's tough.
They've been quietly living. Well, I mean, they're all gone now, but they were from 1967 to around, I'm going to say 2014. You can correct the year. Living quietly with that knowledge for that period of time. That's hard to live with.
I had no idea how they did it. I mean, to me, it's incredible. I remember the platoon sergeant. I knew when I first started doing the research into that, I knew I needed to talk to the platoon commander and the platoon sergeant because I needed to know what their tactical and strategic objectives were for that day. That was imperative. And so I talked to the platoon commander, and he ended up dying of an aggressive form of cancer, maybe 6 weeks after I talked with him. So I'm glad I didn't waste any time because I it was in talking with him. But then I talked to the platoon sergeant. He had gone on, moved to Denmark, married a Danish woman. He became a millionaire. He got 6 kids and 7 grandkids at the time of his death in 2019. But I knew he was from Michigan, and some of the Marines told me he's from Michigan. Then he came home to Michigan like once or twice a year to visit his family. Excuse me. And so I sent him 2 emails. They gave me his email address, and I never heard back from him. And I just figured, well, it's probably too hard for him. I'm not going to press him on it because, it'd be hard for him. But I remember Atlanta one night, it was in 2009. I remember that. He called me on a Saturday night at 9 o'clock. He said, John, this is Sergeant Ron Posey. I apologize for just getting back to you, but it took me till right now to get the courage to call you.
Wow.
And I said in the email that because I knew it was. Somebody told me he was going to Macon, Georgia to pay respects to the gravesite for the first time. And I told him we'd love to meet him. The Davis family would love to meet him. Not to blame him, obviously, to meet somebody who served with their brother, their father, their loved one. And that's what I said in the email. And he said, John, I got your email. He respectfully asked I came alone. He was with his family from Denmark. And he asked I can't come alone because he said it took everything I had to get the courage to call you. I can't face the entire Davis family. And I immediately dropped everything I was doing, went down the next morning. And he and his family went to the gravesite. And I let them go by themselves. I knew it was going to be hard for him. I met him at a Barnes & Noble about 2 miles away. And, Paul, we talked for over 4 hours. He cried the entire 4 hours. I cried about half of it.
Yeah.
And when he left, we were going to leave. We just hugged each other, and we were crying. And he offered to draw me a map. And I get so emotional because you know how many ghosts that conjured back up after so many years for him. And that's how much it meant, And he told me it was a story worth telling. And I owe Sergeant Davis at least that much. And so he got back to Denmark. I remember 2 days later, I was in Atlanta cooking dinner. I just happened to read checking some emails. I got an email from him, and I just started crying. My wife was like, what's wrong? I showed her the email. It was Ron Posey. He was back in Denmark thanking me. He'd been married for more than 40 years, had 2 adult kids, grandkids, all that stuff. He had never spoken with anyone, friends, family, no one, about anything that happened in Vietnam, let alone that day. I was the very first person he'd ever spoken with about it. And he was thanking me for allowing him to sleep a little bit better. I just cried.
Yeah, the what you gave a lot of these guys to a man that you interacted with, therapy is not a strong enough word. In some respects, you gave them their lives back.
I did. And that people have always, one of my friends have asked me why I keep pushing this story. And I told them because if not me, then who? These men, you're helping families, people are desperately in need of peace. And so Ron and I talked for a long time. We stayed in contact. And about 3 years later, we stayed in regular contact. 3 years later, he came back to Macon for Davis family reunion and met the entire family. There must have been 100 people at the dinner Saturday night. And Sergeant Davis' younger brother introduced him. I'll never forget it. He said, I lost one brother in Vietnam, but I got another one in Ron. They hugged each other. There was not a dry eye in the room.
There's no way. No way.
I almost tear up just thinking about it right now. So,
I mean, I don't know any of these people. You're the only one involved in this story that I know, and it's making me tear up.
And it makes you feel good. You did something good. You helped bring peace to people who desperately needed it. That's the thing I'm most proud of. And then when my book came out in 2018, I remember there's another moment. Remember, I get a phone call from it was a Michigan number. And there was at 4:30, 5 o'clock to George Mason. Normally, I don't answer phone calls. I don't recognize the number, but something just told me to do it. And it was a woman who was the niece to Sergeant Posey, who's a platoon sergeant. And her father was Sergeant Posey's brother. And they had no idea that he'd gone to Macon, part of the Davis family reunion or anything. And she said she came in like the day before. She saw her father reading my book and was crying. She said her father and Ron were really close. So he went to Vietnam, and he was different when he came back. He had changed. And they didn't know why. And his nieces and nephews just thought he was a weird old man, didn't know why. She came in and saw her father read my book and crying because she realized why Ron had changed. And that understanding, she thanked me for giving her uncle the voice he could never muster. Can you imagine being told that?
I can't.
I cried like a baby. And after he died of natural causes and cancer in 2020, the family been real close the last 3 or 4 years. They came together. The whole family was in Denmark with Ron when he passed away, and they called me after the service and thanked me for allowing them to have those years with their uncle and getting to know him.
Yeah, I mean,
I just, yeah. It's that's why I did it.
Well, and a thought came into my head, and it's because I'm human and I care about other people. Like, we've got a lot of guys that are in their late 20s
and need the same thing.
40s. Yep.
Yep. I can't imagine going my whole life like those guys did before you finally get some peace. And that's the thing I always tell my friends. Like, my son is 19 years old, and I pray to God he never sees the face of war. But if he did, I hope somebody would help him in the same way.
Yeah, it makes.
By the way, when I go to Vietnam, I'm speaking at the state dinner, and this is what I'm going to be saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I mean, I don't want to evaluate or rate it, but it's all top shelf stuff, man.
Thank you.
Oh gosh,
it's never been about money or notoriety or anything. It's about you can do something really good and really help a lot of people who need it.
I have a feeling that there are thousands is overstating. Hundreds, the level of personal courage Sergeant Davis showed that day, it probably puts in the single digits, maybe low double digits. But there are probably other, maybe not as heroic. And I'm not trying to evaluate level of heroics here, but there have to be hundreds of stories just from the Vietnam era where those stories haven't been told. Therapy and healing hasn't happened. The idea of achieving normalcy with your extended family because now they understand why you were that way when you came back.
Exactly.
And look, I'm not old enough to remember Vietnam veterans coming back. My dad is a Vietnam veteran, and I know he and I did not talk about Vietnam until about 4 years ago, and he really opened up to me, and it made me very happy that we had that conversation.
That's great.
I hope in some small ways helped him.
I'm sure it did.
In bigger ways. And look, I've told this story 100 times, and I'm going to tell it again here. He told me 2 stories about Vietnam, and it was just sort of happenstance, the situations that we were in for him to tell those stories, and they weren't super detailed, just sort of high level. Yeah, these things happen. And then it was actually on the podcast, and after the podcast that I did with my dad, where he couldn't stop talking about it. And when we stopped recording, I said, "Dad, how come you didn't tell me all those stories?" And he gave me the most beautiful, simple answer. He goes, "You never asked." Wow. And I'm like, just the simple act of asking questions about these guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you obviously did it in a way that was as comprehensive as you could possibly be. You poured through 1,300 documents.
Yep.
I mean, yeah, I think those guys deserve that level. And of course, it's not possible to provide that in every possible scenario, but we should be doing more of it.
Yeah. And it was a little bit different for Sergeant Davis because he was a Medal of Honor recipient. So there were obviously a lot more documents and stuff like that for them to give me, and it's incredible. I mean, it's absolutely incredible.
It's going to go.
One point, here's the funny part. But the one point when the book came out, my first book went to Secretary Armitage, and he noticed that they, in Rodney Davis's official military record, they had forgotten to give him a Purple Heart. So he has General Keith McKenzie, who's the 3-star general at headquarters Marine Corps, future commander of CENTCOM, personally led an investigation and corrected it. It was unbelievable.
Wow.
At the time, he was working for the Joint Chiefs staff. He was like, I forgot what his title was, the Joint Chiefs. So I got this, it was never forget, I got this big brown envelope from the Joint Chiefs of Staff addressed to me. I remember laughing at my friends, like, pretty sure it's the only time in my life I'm going to have anything addressed to me from the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Well, I mean, look,
they headquarters Marine Corps issue a new ribbons rack for me to give to the Davis family.
Yeah, good for them. I love Marines. I met a few of them when I was overseas, and they're all like they'll do whatever they need to do to accomplish the mission and protect the guy to the right and the guy to the left of them. And that's cliche, but it means something to a small set of folks.
It does. And they treated me great. I mean, literally, I was going back and forth from Atlanta to Marine Corps base Quantico, where the historical division is. And the base commander heard about me and heard about my story. They gave me a job in public affairs at Lejeune Hall at Marine Corps base Quantico. So I was up there during the week. I had all the paper, credentials. I could go back and forth to the Pentagon and the historical division at Quantico, and they treated me great. And I was on the gun range. Those guys like 2 or 3 times a week. They treated me great. I got to fly in helicopters, do virtual combat training with them. They treated me great.
Yeah, I mean, look, the world's your oyster, as one of the sayings goes. I mean, even with, let's say you had zero connection to the Davis family and you never did what you did with Sergeant Davis, you've lived a pretty incredible life. But man, this Sergeant Davis thing is, woo, man.
It's funny you mentioned that because one of my friends asked me if the book came out. I was like, "How do you top this one?" I was like, "You don't, and you don't even try."
Yeah,
because this is it. And this is part I forgot to mention. I got invited to a Medal of Honor ceremony at the White House at one point. I was sitting there right behind the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 2015 with the Obama White House for a Medal of Honor ceremony.
That had to be an amazing experience.
It was incredible. I mean, reason is, like, I had called the White House in the researching this book because I know the Davis family had gone up there with President Nixon presented the Medal of Honor. And so I called the White House to get pictures, transcripts, that sort of thing. And they obviously take notes on all the phone calls. Like 2 years later, out of the blue, I get a phone call from the White House asking me if I was still working on this book, a Medal of Honor recipient, Sergeant Rodney Davis. And I was like, "Yes, ma'am." And they invited me to the Medal of Honor ceremony. Wow.
So you go through every day, and there's a decent chance you get a call from some amazing officer, amazing person. I mean, seriously, you had lunch with Armitage today.
I did. Yeah.
Oh man,
it's surreal sometimes.
Yeah, I bet.
It's a long ways from those days in Fredericksburg, Virginia, I guess, but never too far. You never get too big for your britches. You never forget who you are and where you've come from.
Well, that's why you have an older and a younger brother, right?
Yeah.
So what are you most excited about on the trip in terms of prepping for the trip before you guys actually fly out?
Well, I think I remember I told you we've got a Marine benefactor who's paying for the whole trip for everybody, and that's it. To me, it's just been great, and I just want to go. I just want to, this is something the Davis family needs. This is something I need. Want to see it, and I think all the veterans who are going with us all need. And it's good for the Vietnamese government, the Vietnamese officials as well, and just feel like you're doing something good. I mean, I guess as far as prepare for, I think we're in pretty good shape. I think everything's in good shape. We've locked in a hotel and air reservations and all that stuff. The Vietnamese government is fantastic. We're having Secretary Armitage is pre-recording a video for our group to play when we get there. The Department of Defense is organizing a discussion for us. They're doing it by video, and like I said, that state dinner. We're going to the city of Way as well. And one of our Marines who's going with us was a Marine platoon commander at Way City, and so he's going to speak to our group before we go there, and then we're going to go to Way. And I know it's going to be emotional for him too. He lost a lot of men in his platoon in that fight, and then we have that state dinner on that Saturday night, and it's going to be incredible. I don't think I've ever looked forward to more than anything in my life than that, as far as professionally. And then I'm going to Tokyo for a few days after the trip.
Because you can.
Because I can. I figure I put this together. I need a few days just to unwind.
So, John, our first discussion on this podcast, we laughed a lot. You and I both got a little teary-eyed a few times in this discussion.
Yep.
It reminds me of the Valvano speech that he gave at the SB.
Sure. Yeah.
Don't
ever give up.
Yeah. Well, think, laugh, and cry every day. So you're helping me do that at least in podcast episodes. And I'm hoping that we have giant smiles on our faces because you've had an amazing trip the next time we get together on this podcast.
I think it'd be a great trip. I'm really looking forward to it. And for me, it's just a chance at the end to do something really good and bring some closure to people who need it, for the Davis family. My son, he's Sergeant Davis's great nephew. He looks just like Rodney Davis, too.
Really?
He does, yeah.
He's a good-looking kid, then.
He's a good-looking kid, yeah. I won't tell him that. He'll tell you.
Is he going to listen to this?
He probably will. I'm going to send it to him.
Yeah, cool.
So,
how old are your boys again?
I just have one son. He's 19.
Son, that's right.
Yeah, he's a college student in Ireland, actually.
Yeah, you told me that last time, which is
Yep.
I was not so bold when I was 19.
I wasn't either, but their kids today are just totally different when we grew up.
Yeah, my daughter's in England right now, semester abroad.
Oh wow, that's great.
Yeah, it's wild. She can't wait to see her. We haven't seen her since January.
Oh wow,
well, that's not true. No, we went over for spring break. Actually, we did see her for a week or so. Yeah. All right. So, John, you're going to come back maybe in September or October, a few weeks after the trip, kind of thing. And I really appreciate you doing this short notice, especially. I said this at the beginning. I'll say it again. I wish that my timing was a bit better.
Oh, this is fine. It's perfect.
I think it's fine too. And by the way, yeah, here's a fun question. How do you get to write an op-ed on Memorial Day for the Richmond Times-Dispatch when you have no connection to the city of Richmond or the metro area?
It's a great story. That's why. It's not about, it's a great story. And also the fact that, I know the opinion page editor too.
There's part of the answer.
I'm the media relations manager for George Mason University, which is the largest university in the state. So, of course, I'm going to know the opinion page editors for all the major papers. And so I reached out to his name is Scott Bass. I reached out to him and told him I had a great story. For Memorial Day, it was a perfect story. And the fact it was black and white guys we were talking about, and it was a great story,
Well, that chaplain that you included in the piece, how did you hear about his story?
Well, I knew about his story in the researching of the Sergeant Davis story. I knew about it. And Father Vincent Capodanno is one of 9 chaplains to have been awarded the Medal of Honor. And I knew about his story anyway. I actually mentioned him in my book. He's mentioned in my book as well. Yeah. And our benefactor actually knew him. And he asked if we honor him as well. I'm happy to do it.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. That's awesome. John, I'm so glad Mike Woods connected us.
Me too. Me too.
Yeah. I can't say tonight was fun, but it warmed my heart because you're doing good things, and I wish you nothing but the best as you move forward, man.
We'll have to catch up at a football game or something this year. UVA football game.
They're hard to go to, man.
They are.
I hope we're a little bit better this year. You can't get much worse.
I'm actually taking Mike Woods with me next week. We're going to Charlottesville for the opening ceremony for the new football complex.
I don't know anything. I'm going to end the recording, and then I would love for you to tell me about that.
Okay.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts. We'd also really appreciate if you'd rate and review us. You can find us at scodupodcast.com.